Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. What was your thoughts on this race? Did you enjoy this race? I thought it was a fairly dull race, even though we had a little bit of contention for those constructors' standings and the driver standings, for those third and fourth positions. It was more along the lines of how can we, outrank the other teams in general more than a true race. Yes, we had a little bit of pit strategy going on with that contention in play, but it really didn't affect the overall standings that much in my view. So I thought it was a fairly dull race. It was pretty much, nose to tail around this track. You kind of got a little bit of leeway, and of course you had Max leading fairly significantly after he switched over to those hard tires. But what was your thoughts? If you could leave those below, I would appreciate it. And I will go through each driver and give you my reaction to those drivers as they go through the list, as I normally do. So I'll start off in 20th position with Kevin Magnussen. So Kevin Magnussen had a horrible race today. He only started off in 17th position after not being able to qualify as well as they were hoping he would be in that new chassis that they had brought over, the Vegas period. And it just really hasn't given them all that they needed in all these races that they were hoping to, with Kevin kind of falling back a little bit more than Nico Hülkenberg in this race, which is kind of reverse from the previous race. But he ended up trying to pit really early on lap 6 and trying to see if there was anything that he could do to get that off pit strategy going. That did not work out for him at all. I think they were hoping to get a couple of safety cars or something to that effect to help boost them into that ranking. So not a good day for him. He did a decent start, not losing any positions, but overall, he just wasn't wearing those tires the way he wanted to and was falling back into the field, having a battle with the Williams and the Alfa Romeos. But overall, as I said, not the day for Kevin. I think he said the best thing what he thought was that it was over. And so that gives you his feelings on this race. Then we have Valtteri Bottas, who started in 18th and ended up in 19th. He went for a really long stint on the first bout with hard tires, going 30 laps, and then switching over to the mediums. He did gain 2 positions, but on that long stint, he basically lost all of the positions plus more that he was in, and just didn't have the long-term pace on those tires that they were hoping to. So when him switching over, doing those, one-stop race did not really play out for Valtteri Bottas. I'm not sure if it was exactly his fault that Alfa Romeo hasn't looked really good in a long time. And so they need a lot of work over the break to see if they can get, that new car in line a little bit better. I know they're kind of scrapping out with that concept and coming up with a new concept. So hopefully that'll be more competitive this coming season. Carlos Sainz started off in 16th and was the last person to finish the lap down. Ended up in 18th position. He was really going for a safety car or some other break in the race to actually help him out, as he went really long and stayed out there while he did a 24 laps on that first hard tire, and then switched again on lap 57. So he was really hoping to get that second stint under a caution or something else that would help him boost him up into this ranking a little bit more. And in fact, I think he actually ended up just pulling into the pits for the last lap. So even though he was still in 18th position, it was not a good day for Carlos. It's really fighting everything in that Ferrari over the weekend, unlike his teammate. I do have him, passing Hulkenberg on lap 28 for 15th, and passing Bottas on lap 29 for 14th. So he did get up into the point range. In fact, he was doing fairly decent in that last bit of the race, except for the fact that he had to pit to get onto those medium tires to meet the regulations. And so that kind of hurt him in that fact that when he pitted, they put him back to the very back of the pack because he was hoping to, as I said, get that safety car or some other factor that would help him boost him up without dropping him back into the rear of the grid. Then you have Juan Yuzhou, who outqualified, well, not outqualified, he outdid his teammate, qualified in 19th position and worked his way up to 17th. Not the greatest race. He had a little bit of a bad start, losing one position at the very beginning of the race. Pitted on lap 14 and then lap 38 during his race. Trying to make the most out of that Alfa Romeo. I think he did a lot better job than Valtteri did in the stint, but not enough to really where it mattered in that Alfa Romeo. Really couldn't get past the Williams, and it's only partially past the Haas team. So not the greatest weekend for the Alfa Romeo, but again, hopefully they'll come up with a new concept next season, which will be more competitive in the long run. Logan Sargent didn't have a horrible race, even though his qualifying was horrible, missing 2 timed laps, dropping him back to that 20th position. So he started off in 20th and worked his way up to 16th. Have him basically passing Ricardo on lap 38 for that 15th position, and then dropping back down into the 16th because of Nico Hulkenberg. But doing a decent job there, gained his position on the start of the race, was able to kind of keep it in that ranking. That Williams was not looking as well as it should on those long straightaways. I think that was middle section was really hurting them. And then, of course, the straightaways, I think some other people were able to get them DRS that helped them in those long stretches as well. So Williams wasn't where they wanted to, but they lucked out not getting overtaken from that constructor's point of view from the AlphaTauri. So just shy from that. So it was good on them for that. And I think Logan did a decent job this weekend. Is it well enough to get re-signed by Williams for next season? That is the question. As I said, having that issue in qualifying, but he was making progress to some degree on these last 5 races. Is that enough progress for Williams to keep him, or with all this new talent that is out there, will they actually sign someone else as a rookie and keep, for that second position in that Williams? Nico Hulkenberg qualified 8th, ended up at 15th. He had a phenomenal qualifying session, getting up there into that 8th spot. But then, of course, that Haas could not maintain that position to save his life, dropping back quite a bit on the start of the race, dropping 4 positions, and then, having a quick pit stop on lap 14, and then 34 for that Haas, trying to see if they can get those tires to work, but they were just burning through those tires too quickly, not having the downforce that they need, or too much downforce in certain circumstances, wearing the tires out. So not a good end for Haas, running the back of the pack like they have been, but a decent run from Nico Hulkenberg, kind of helping them show what they have done, especially in that old spec of that car, getting all the way up into that 15th position. So they need some work done on that Haas. Hopefully they can develop that and get the expertise to know what they've done wrong, or compromise between the two to figure out what tracks work best to have that good mix and get them up in the running for the full season next year, and not just beginning and have the updates kind of peter out. So they fall back into the back of the pack. Alex Albon qualified 14th and ended up 14th. He did have a bad start, losing 4 positions on the start, but then he was able to pass Juan Yuzhou on lap 27th for 17th position, He did pit on lap 17 from mediums to hards, and then lap 44 again for another set of hards. So Williams was decent on the straightaways, but I think it was just lacking what it needed to in the high-speed corners, not being quite on point with the rest of the field, struggling in that run. So we have Alex Elborn. Not a lot of information, but not the ideal ending for Williams. I know they were hoping to get a little bit farther up and get some points in this race, thinking it would be a better racetrack for them when it ended up not being. So they have some work to do over the off season to get a really good grip on that Williams car, try to figure out how that car really works in that aerodynamic, keeping them from those windy conditions and some of those peak performances, peakiness. So knowing how to really handle all of the setup in that Williams might help them out next season. We'll have to see what they can do over the off season. Again, being back runner, even though they kind of ended up in that seventh overall constructor standing, not really gaining any points this race or the last couple of races, kind of put them on back guard. Pierre Gasly qualified in 10th and ended up in 13th. I basically have that he was really struggling with that car. I'm not sure if there's something that actually happened. I know they're saying that there's some kind of damage that happened to his Alpine, and he was on a slightly different strategy. I know he didn't like that Esteban Ocon, his teammate, that was able to undo the tire strategy and to that pit strategy, kind of overtake him on, through that mechanism. So he was going to have to kind of deal with those team to try to figure out the exact reasoning for behind that, ending up just behind his teammate. When your teammate is your goal to beat the first thing and being able to, out qualify him, but then end up behind him. I know that's frustrating for him. He did have roughly a decent run, except for that issue and having to fall back a little bit in the race. He gained 2 positions on the start. He passed Hulkenberg on lap 19 for 15th position. He passed Sargent on lap 40 for 15th again. Just having a 2-stop race, kind of worked his way through. Not the best overall for Pierre Gasly, but it's not a super downer. I think the Alpine just need to do a little bit more tweaking to help them getting the point running ability more on a consistent basis for them over the off season. So hopefully they can make some of those adjustments. And then Esteban Ocon did a decent run, but not the greatest run, qualifying in 12th and ended up in 12th. I basically have him passing Bottas on lap 24 for the 11th position. He did pit on lap 16, so ahead of his teammate, switch from those mediums to hards, and then he went back, for that second set. Not quite the mechanism for Ocon. I know he's gotten up there running with the main point runners, but then that hard tire was not holding on as well as they would have liked, and dropping back down into that 12th position. So I said, not a great run from Esteban, but not a bad run. I didn't see any really mistakes. I didn't see any great passes, but I didn't see any issues, except for just that Alpine was not able to maintain the pace with the people in front of him, like Daniel Ricciardo, who ended up qualifying in 15th, not the greatest qualifying, but ended up working his way all the way up, almost into the points, into that 11th position. So he ended up having issues to start off the bat. Had like a tear off or something to that effect that got caught in one of his air ducts that made him pit on lap 8. So a really early pit stop for him to switch from those mediums to hards, which kind of set his racing segment to be from the back of the pack, and he was still able to make his way up to that 11th position. So a decent run for him. Kind of a shame that we had that issue with that AlphaTauri on that overheating because of some debris, which is probably a tear off from some other driver that really compromised his run in this race. as we saw his teammate Yuki go pretty far up and then fall back at the very end of the race. So if Daniel could have gotten up to a couple of points, they may have weren't able to push Williams out of that 7th position. But a decent run for Daniel, even though he started off bad. He didn't let him, ruin his race. He kind of got back into it and worked his way up to 11th, where he almost had some points in the bag. So good for him. This leads us to the top 10, where we have Lance Stroll, who qualified in 13th and ended up in 10th, gaining that extra point for the Aston Martins. He had a pretty clean race. He did, no losses, no gains in the start, and was able to work his way in. I see he passed Daniel Ricciardo on lap 29 for 10th, and then passed Ocon on lap 50 for 11th, and worked his way into that 10th position due to Sainz, I think, dropping out from the upper part of this ranking due to having that last pit stop that he had to do, making him go into that point position of 10th position. So not a super awesome race for Lance, but not a bad race for Lance. He could probably still learn a few things, even though he's not that far behind Fernando Alonso. I think some of his strategy, if he could pick up some of that, he could probably work his way up a couple of spots to be behind his teammate in that regard and helping out that Aston Martin a little bit more than he has this year. But said that it was a clean race for him, did a good job getting into those points. So decent run for Lance Stroll. Lewis didn't like this car all this weekend, qualifying 11th, just getting out of that spot, but he worked his way up to 9th overall. He did gain 2 spots at the very beginning of the race, and we saw lots of Lewis as he was able to work his way back and forth through this grid as he was going through his pit stop strategy and whatnot, because he had contact with Gasly, which had a front wing end plate damage on his car, but they kept that damage because they didn't think it was actually hurting them as much it would be for the time period for replacing that front wing. So he ended up passing Albon on lap 17 for 9th. He passed Alonso on lap 38 for 11th, Ocon on lap 44 for 10th, and Sainz on lap 48 for 9th. And then, of course, he ended up in that 9th position as Sainz ended up dropping out. So not quite where Lewis wanted to be. If Lewis could have gotten a few more points, it might have helped him out a little bit more, safeguarded that Mercedes position. I think he probably could have done that a little bit better. I know he was really fighting this car overall, so I know he was hoping to get more out of that. So maybe they can kind of have a different concept a little bit more in this Mercedes to help really solidify Lewis Hamilton's position that we know he can drive in that Mercedes over the off season. But generally doing a decent job, even though he didn't like the vehicle that he was in. So I give him credit for that during this race, because I know he was really struggling for the practice sessions and qualifying in this Mercedes, that he just wasn't quite where he wanted to be. Couldn't really get the tweaks that he needed to feel comfortable throughout this circuit. So we have Yuki Tsunoda, who got driver of the day, who qualified in 6th, ended up in 8th. At one point, it looked like he was going to be into that 6th position at the end, but then the tires weren't holding on as well as he would have liked, and had Oscar and Fernando pass him in those last few laps. But really good job for Yuki. Really good in showing that AlphaTauri can actually, with those updates that they did for that floor, really take on. So hopefully they can use that as an advantage for the off season to really build upon that and come out competitive for next season. It was really good to see Yuki actually lead the race for a few laps as Max Verstappen, pitted and then having to work his way back up through the field. So Yuki went a little bit longer in that run. giving him several laps in the lead, which is always neat to see when you have those new drivers take on that lead of the race, even though it's mainly due to pit strategy more than really competitiveness in the running. But Yuki really did a good job. He did pass Daniel on lap 22 for ninth position. He did pit his on 23, switching from mediums to hards in that stint. Really running really well on those medium tires for a decent amount of time that got him up into that top position where he could lead the race. And then when he pitted, build his way back up into those front runner positions as everybody else was shifting around. I think Yuki did an excellent job this weekend getting to where he was. I'm not sure what he could have done more to get farther up. I know the AlphaTauri is not the best, so it really wasn't competing with the McLarens, and the Aston Martins were kind of right there at that edge. So they may have been able to do more with them, but with everything else, I think Yuki did an excellent job and basically show what he can do in that AlphaTauri. So hopefully they can really take that off season and give him a car that he can actually perform in next season. It'd be neat to see Yuki competing, on a regular basis for decent points next season, and see where Daniel Ricciardo would end up with that competition of Yuki as well. So, with all that said, I think, as I said, Yuki did a decent job, a really good job actually. Even just making it to 8th, gaining those 4 points for AlphaTauri, which was not quite enough to bump them up, but it was a good run for him. Alonso qualified in 7th and ended up 7th. He did come across the radio at one point saying that they thought he had the slowest car on the straightaways by far, which then, we saw a couple of passes on those straightaways that kind of emphasized that point, but I'm not sure if that was truly the case. I think he was more comparative to the McLarens and the Red Bulls, as well as, of course, George in that stint were faster than that Aston Martin during this race and didn't really have a chance to really push forward in that. But he wasn't, that far ahead, behind in those straightaways, I think, as the other people behind him. So I think that was kind of like an exaggeration, but it is kind of showing his frustration as the Aston Martin had that really good beginning for the season and then was kind of petered out, taking that wrong turn and having to redevelop some of that Aston Martin to get back into a little bit of a fight in these last few races. I think he did a really good job of, working his way, his magic, doing what he can do to get into that 7th position. I know there's lots of controversy over him basically trying to break a little bit sooner than he needed to when Lewis was behind him on that straightaway, hoping to get that DRS in that next corner. And I kind of agree in this situation where he really probably shouldn't be doing that, even though that is technically probably would have helped him out if Lewis passed him. I mean, he could have swung in right behind him and got that DRS to help pull him forward a little bit farther into this circuit. But that could, very potential for a really bad accident. So, and it looked like, I'm not sure if he was trying to pull over, trying to give him, Hamilton a lot of room, or if it was because he kind of took his eyes off where he was going, where he kind of pulled off to the side of the track and almost hit the, those markers for braking points in this that corner, as he looked like he almost did hit and have to actually kind of readjust to get back onto that track. So generally, I thought Fernando Alonso did a really good job. Besides that kind of issue that he was shown with Hamilton on kind of a braking, I'm not sure if they're going to do any fining for that or kind of talking to him about that. Hopefully they can kind of work out a way to discourage that in the future for any driver overall, because we don't have that front tire collide with that back tire and really throw those cars up into the air that could be seriously dangerous in that regard. But he did pass Bottas on lap 20 for 9th, passed Ocon on lap 43 for 10th, passed Sainz on lap 46 for 9th, and then passed Yuki on lap 57 for 7th. So he did a good job maintaining those positions, getting ahead of those people when he could in the corners, even though he didn't have the straightaway speed that he wanted to on those long straights. He was still able to make several passes in this circuit. So keeping all his race, wise objectiveness, he did a decent job in this running. Then we have Oscar Piastri, who qualified in 3rd and ended up 6th. You think that he did a bad job in that regard, but I think he did actually a fairly good job. He is a rookie after all, even though he doesn't really show it that much in this running. Dropping back into that 6th position, I don't think the McLarens really had it in store for the Red Bulls, of course, and I think George still actually outpaced them quite significantly as well. So with that and the Ferrari, it was kind of hard to see them any other positions in this running. I think he did a good job, even though he ended up behind his teammate in this run. I think he learned a lot more during the season from his teammates, kind of maintaining those tires. I think he started doing a better job this race of tire management, even though it wasn't perfect. Like Lando has that nice feel for those tires, but did a really good job in this running and ended up right behind his teammate into that 6th position, gaining McLaren decent points, keeping them ahead of those Aston Martins, which was their main objective for this race. I have him passing Bottas on lap 20 for 8th, passing Sainz on lap 40 for 8th, and then passing Yuki on lap 44 for 6th. So, as I said, at the very end of the race, Yuki was dropping back on those tires where other people could make those maneuvers and pass that AlphaTauri. So not quite where that AlphaTauri wanted to be, but good on that McLaren to get a good solid point run between the Lando and Oscar in that 5th and 6th position. Then we have Lando, who qualified in 5th and ended up in 5th. He did gain 1 position on the start of the race and basically ended up overtaking his teammate on lap 4 for that 3rd position. Getting up there, and then he had a bad pit stop, so he kind of pushed him back behind George Russell in that pit strategy as George went farther in, couldn't gain ground on him, and actually George was kind of pulling away from him, so he tried to pit again to try to undercut him, but that didn't quite work out. He got close, but he didn't quite get to that point where he could undercut George to keep him behind him. And so in the end, of course, Sergio Perez came by and was able to overtake him as well, getting closer towards George in that running, and actually passed George and Charles at that one point during this race. So he was up into that 2nd position if it wasn't for that 5-second penalty. But overall, since I'm talking about Lando, I think Lando did a good job. Basically everything he could onto that McLaren, even though it wasn't quite where he wanted it to be. He thought that McLaren probably had a better run for this last race than it really did. But still a good ending for the McLaren as they kind of came from the back of the pack to the front of the pack in this season, kind of competing with the Red Bulls a little bit more heavily in the last few races. So good on Lando for this run, even though it wasn't the, star running run that he would have probably wanted it to be. Sergio Perez came in qualifying in 9th, a little bit farther back, and then worked his way up to 4th position. So Sergio did lose 1 position at the start of the race, but he ended up working his way all the way back up to the front of the grid and almost got onto the podium, except for the contact that he had with Lando, and I'm not sure. He was kind of got alongside him into the inside of the corner, And then Lando kind of turned into him as Sergio was kind of going more straight, having a longer turn apex point. They called it against Sergio Perez. It's hard to see. I could see him, basically not, trying to make the corner, so that I could see them saying that he's going to have to end up crashing into Lando. But I also see that Lando probably should have been aware of him and been aware that he needed to give a little bit more room in that regard too. So I'm thinking it was probably more of a racing incident than it really turned out to be. And that 5 second really hurt Sergio Perez in this run. So otherwise he would have been on the podium, at least in that third position, if not into that second position due to that 5 second penalty. So a really good run for him, even though his qualifying didn't match up to where his teammate was. He did lots of passing through this course. I see that he did about 8 passes throughout this race to get where he was. And then, of course, in the pit strategy, going in and out as well. So a really good run for him, even though it doesn't show it quite as well as it did on the end results because of that penalty that he received. George Russell qualified in 4th and ended up in 3rd. He did lose a position on the first lap, but was able to regain that and work his way up to that 3rd position overall. As I said, he gained a position on Lando through the pit strategy, pitting early, getting out ahead of him because of the pit stop that was long for the McLaren, which is unusual. But I was able to get that done. Game ahead, get him a little bit of leeway. And then said Lando tried to redo that against George later, but that didn't work out for him. So it was a really good run for George, really gaining the positions and the points that Mercedes needed to keep him where they were, which was good to see. I see that he passed Oscar on lap 11 for 4th, Bottas on lap 18th for 6th, Sainz on lap 22 for 5th, Stroll on lap 36 for 7th, and Yuki on lap 39 for 4th. Then, of course, he got around up into that front-running 3rd position as well, and was able to just maintain that, even though technically George passed him and Charles in this race. I know Charles speaking of him, qualified in 2nd and ended up in 2nd. He gave a little bit of fight to Max on the very start of this race, but then quickly basically lined up and followed him on those medium tires stint. But as soon as Max got on the hard tires, he kind of ran away with it, where that Red Bull just kind of shined versus that Ferrari. Charles Leclerc did a really good job of just kind of keeping it in that 2nd position the whole way through, kind of giving it, the strategy that he needed. In fact, he really kind of shown what his mind can do, because he was like, okay, he saw Sergio Perez coming up through the field and knew he had the 5 second penalty. So he was trying to work his way through, trying to, give that right behind, give that position to Sergio Perez, knowing he would gain it back because of the 5 seconds, to try to push the Mercedes farther back into the pack to keep them, to see if that Ferrari could actually gain that position on the constructor standing. So that was kind of the excitement we saw in this race, is more for the constructor standings and potentially for the drivers standings than the actual race. So it was all kind of based on that. So it was more about tire management, maintaining the positions that they had, keeping those where they wanted to in the whole race. So it wasn't full out racing as we saw in the past. So that's why I say it's kind of a dull race in my view, even though we had some pit strategy going on in this race. Then, of course, we have Max, who had the fastest lap, started off in 1st position, ended up in 1st position. As I said, he had a little bit of fight with Charles Leclerc on that first lap, maybe the first 2 laps, kind of going back and forth a little bit, but was able to, outdo him in the corners. I'm not sure if Charles gave him all that he could, but Charles, I'm sure, knew that Max would have eventually overtake him anyway, so he kind of didn't fight him as hard as he probably would have fought somebody else. But in the regards, Max was able to get out front, did the medium stint of tires relatively close to the rest of the pack, but as soon as he started getting those hard tires on, he either started pulling away from the pack. I have him at 5.4 second lead on lap 26. He did gain a nice leeway, so we could pit again without any really issues of maintaining that lead, getting up there. And by the end, he was 17.9 seconds ahead of Charles Leclerc. So a really decent run, decent lead, really, over that second position. So no really, strategy involved in keeping people behind, having to really push that race. I mean, he could just kind of set it on autopilot at that point and just kind of go around that track. Very good. Well, I'm not downplaying Max's driving capability, because, being able to do that and without actually lapsing your concentration and doing mistakes is another thing entirely as well. So it was really good for Max, leading it off first to first on the first of the race to the end of the race, gaining the fastest lap again, showing what he can do, leading 1,000 laps for the season, I think it was. So that was really impressive, as well as having 19 wins in a season. Really phenomenal for Max Verstappen to just outshine everybody else in that Red Bull, as we will see in the driver standings later. So during this driver standing, we have Max with 575 points over his teammate, Sergio Perez, who had 285. So over double the points from his teammate in this running, kind of outshining his teammates dramatically, even though, you may think that Sergio Perez is not that good of a driver, but I think it's just mainly because of the rest of the field. You basically say that just according to Max, his teammate's not that good. He still got second place. He still beat out Lewis Hamilton. He still beat out Fernando Alonso as we go through these, beat out Lando Norris is coming through, beat out the Ferraris. So I can't, talk bad about Sergio Perez. There might be a better second driver out there, but whether you gain them to be able to be that second driver because they're their primary driver in their current team is another story entirely. So that's kind of a big push and pull there to figure out how well that Red Bull team is going to work. I think Sergio did a really good job, decently over the season, even though he had some up and downs, and that confidence strategy, was really hurting him in the mid part of this season. As I said, though, the top three were kind of set in stone last weekend. So what we saw was really the fight for fourth here, where Alonso actually was able to get into that fourth position because Carlos was out of the points, dropping him back down to seventh. This pushed up Alonso into that fourth position, tied with Charles Leclerc into that fifth position with 206 points. Lando kind of solidified that sixth position where he was last week with 205. As we see down the ranking, George kind of made up a little bit of ground, but not enough where really any possible way he could get into that seventh position. And then Oscar Piastri with 97, Lance Stroll with 74, and Pierre Gasly with 62. What we see in the back side of this grid here was that Yuki kind of gaining some points up to 17, but not quite where he could really put any pressure on Alex Albon in this running. And then, of course, we had, at the back of the pack, Nick DeVries, Logan Sargent, and Liam Lawson on that back running portion. This leads us to the constructors standing. So we basically had Red Bull with a whopping 860 points, where Mercedes had 409. So over double the points to the next team. where we had that fight between Ferrari and Mercedes, where Ferrari was hoping that they could gain enough points to overtake Mercedes for that second position, was not quite able to do that due to that no safety car or anything that pushed Carlos back to the very back of the pack. And even that second position for Charles Leclerc couldn't outweigh the Mercedes positions. Then we have McLaren at 302 and Aston Martin at 280. Then we kind of had a little bit of a fight in that seventh position. Of course, you had Alpine at 120, but you had the fight between the AlphaTauris and the Williams. Ended up, a few points behind Williams to overtake that seventh position from AlphaTauri. And we had Haas running up the back end with 12 points. So with that start that Haas had, I was kind of disappointed that they ran into that last position. I was hoping that they could make some improvements over this race, or over the season, I should say, to at least bump them ahead of the Alfa Romeos, who really kind of stagnated early in on the season and just got some decent races that got them some decent points in this season. So what is up next is kind of a comparison video on how were my preseason predictions, and I can tell you a little bit that it wasn't good. My predictions, I kind of led into the hype of the preseason testing and kind of went that direction early on, which kind of laid out some different teams doing better than they were. I did actually have some other situations in that regard that didn't play out. I probably end up splitting this video into each team and how well they did, and from the constructor standings for the drivers in that running as well, just to help not quite clutter it all together as I did kind of in this preseason prediction. Anyway, if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And if you want to see my how my predictions ranked or didn't rank in my the actual end of the season rankings, please subscribe and maybe even hit that bell to see if you get notified in this when that video comes out. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.